US cluster munitions have arrived in Ukraine. Both the Ukrainian and US militaries have confirmed the same. Why do 120 countries around the world reject the use of these munitions? And did the United States really have no choice but to send these bombs to the European battlefront? At the ASEAN foreign ministers meet, much was discussed, including, of course, Ukraine, North Korea, and the ongoing tension between the US and China. But has the Southeast Asian grouping moved closer to a common understanding on the important South China Sea issue? And actors and performers have joined Hollywood writers on strike against the major studios. What are the key issues, and what has brought Hollywood to a grinding halt? Our first story, and we've covered, of course, in the context of the NATO summit through the course of this week, developments on the front of increased US and other military aid to Ukraine, including the most controversial aspect of things, which is the supply of cluster munitions. And now the US defense establishment, the Pentagon that is, confirmed on Thursday that cluster munitions supplied by the US have in fact reached Ukraine for use in the ongoing war. Kiev has vowed to use the munitions judiciously, but with ammunition stocks running low, that seems mere lip service at this point. Cluster bombs are bombs that explode in the air above a target, releasing smaller bomblets, thereby extending the area covered and reducing the ability to limit both collateral damage as well as civilian casualties. Many of these bomblets also, according to reports, do not explode when they are supposed to at all. This leads to littering of the battlefield with several hundred or if not thousands of these little bomblets, which pose a threat long after war is past. Abdul Rahman is in studio to talk more about this specific aspect of the US's military assistance to Ukraine. Abdul, these munitions are banned in 120 countries, but that doesn't include the US or Ukraine or Russia for that matter. But at the point where we are in terms of technology and its use on the battlefield, were there no alternatives available that Joe Biden had to sort of take the decision to finally supply cluster munitions?
Well, even if there are no alternatives available, we don't know. These are the claims made by Biden administration about Ukrainians running out of conventional munition and all. Increasing the production of munition at the time is, of course, always an option. When there is war is going on, and you know that the stockpile of munition is getting over, you produce more. That's what Russia is doing. That's what any other country involved in war is doing. So this particular decision has no rational ground. And this particular excuse that the other munitions have run out is basically an easy way out to shed the responsibility of creating destruction on the ground. If you see, Ukrainians are not using a cluster bomb for the first time. Even if in 2014 there are reports Human Rights Watch has produced, which basically claims that Ukrainians used cluster munition against the Donbas, basically people who were resisting the coup regime at the time in Ukraine, which is the basic origin of the war in Ukraine. And that then there are also reports that during this phase of the war, the Ukrainians have used cluster munitions. So it seems that there is thinking, though it is not there in the public domain, that cluster munitions will provide an edge to the Ukrainian army while they are fighting against the Russian. And given the fact that Ukrainians have agreed that they will not use it against Russia inside Russia, it seems they will only be using, as per their claims, inside their own territory, which is even more problematic, given the fact that they are going to use cluster munition, and given the fact you just talked about the dud rates and all, from anywhere between 2% to 40% bombs do not explode, and at the time of actual use, it may take years to clean it, and while cleaning, thousands of people have died, and there are experiences from across the world wherever they have been used.
Lost limbs, injured, died.
Exactly. For example, Laos is a classic example. Laos and Cambodia, there are reports that around 20,000 people have either died or injured due to the explosion after the war ended in 1975. So you understand the impact of it, and it is not that the US did not know it. US knew it quite well, because that is the largest user of cluster munition. So far, either US has used it or its ally Israel has used it. So they knew the impact of it. They knew there is no real excuse. Still, they are supplying it primarily because they think this is one way they can have some advantage on the ground.
Which we've heard in respect to several other weapons and weapon systems in the past as well, and it seems a bit of in that sense distraction in terms of the larger narrative of how the military operation is progressing, Abdul. But the other interesting part that I saw, and correct me if I'm wrong, was the General Sims, I believe, who was making the presentation or the briefing, saying that we will supply bombs which have a lower dud rate. So they are aware that there are bombs of this nature which have a higher dud rate, and they still keep them in their stockpile. Is that what we are to understand from this?
As per the whatever Human Rights Watch has studied it, they have a report on their website which basically claims that there has been no study conducted by, at least in public domain, conducted by the US Armed Forces, which basically establishes what is the actual dud rates. They claim, that is their claim, without any real experiment on the ground, which basically proves it, that the dud rates are only 2.4%. Or something around 2%, which is still a violation of the US law, which says anything which has a dud rate beyond 1%, US will not export it or not use it anywhere. But okay, leave that aside for a while. That if the claim of 2.4% is not justified. There is no there is no substantiation to that fact. And as per the studies, independent studies which are done, as I said before, the dud rates are anywhere between 2% to 40%, and on an average around 15 to 20% is common. And that has been also proved as, okay, use in Laos and Cambodia was in 1975, before that, but US used it during Afghan war in 2001, used it again in Iraq in 2003, and Israel used it as recent as 2006 in Lebanon. And in all those cases, whatever the studies are there in the public domain, they confirm that the dud rates are really high and much beyond the claims made by the US. So this entire, basically it is an attempt to seek justification, to seek legitimacy for an act which is primarily criminal, which has no justification in international law, and at a time when there are all evidences against it, still you are using it. So yeah, that's the
on the argument that there are good bombs and bad bombs.
Yeah, exactly.
So you mentioned international law. Where does the international community stand on this? Is there any discourse or?
Exactly. See, in 2008, there was a convention signed. Around 120 countries from across the globe have agreed not to produce, not to store, not to use cluster munitions. And of course, as you rightly pointed out, US is not a part of it, Ukraine is not a part of it, Russia is not a part of it, but and they have, and particularly US has used it again and again without any justification. So it seems that the international law is only, does not apply to the US at all. This is again basically the same thing which we have talked about so many times on this show. When it comes to international law, there is a selective application, and whatever does not suit the US, it does not apply. So there is an overwhelming opinion in the world, majority of the countries, as we just said, who are opposed to the use and production of cluster bombs.
All right. We will, of course, keep talking to you on Daily Debrief, but thanks for that update today, Abdul. Anish, we have a nice long session with you on Daily Debrief this afternoon, talking about two stories, of course. First up, ASEAN, like I was just saying, where I don't know. Tell us, are we somewhere? There's been a lot of talk of multilateralism in the right sense of the word. Are we anywhere closer to a common regional understanding, particularly regarding issues related to the South China Sea?
Well, what we saw and what has been agreed upon, if we will go by the reports, it's actually quite close to what we ever were before when it comes to the dispute itself. Now, the five countries, apart from China, Malaysia, also includes Brunei, Philippines, and Vietnam. All the parties, and very interestingly, it does not obviously include Taiwan because Taiwan's claims are pretty much the same as China's claims. So it's pretty much which country you recognize as the China to recognize whether or not they're party to the dispute itself.
Right.
So obviously, so in this case, the five of them have agreed that they will move forward to talks on coming up with a common agreement that will be used for all sorts of dispute resolution. Uh, Probably would include avoiding any kind of aggression in the future, any kind of military confrontations in the regions. And that is quite important because obviously we're talking about five countries with different and several of them overlapping disputed claims on these islands. And the most important part of it is like to create a framework through which all sorts of disputes can be resolved in a manner that is acceptable to all five countries and not fall back on disputed mechanisms that we have already seen with the International Court of Justice being dragged in at one point by the Philippines in this whole thing where obviously China does not recognize the court, and also neither does it recognize the arbitration process that happens within the ICJ. So in all of these cases, having the fact that there will be a common understanding of how to arbitrate, how to negotiate, and those are very basic factors like which islands are disputed, which islands would be considered disputed, and which can be considered like, and apart from the islands, the most important part is obviously the economic zone, the exclusive economic zone that these islands carry, and obviously the resources underneath that really matters, and obviously the geostrategic location, which is basically the connecting point of the east and the west in many ways, and or West Asia, like the whole of the Indo-Pacific region. In fact, most of the trade, in fact, a large part of global trade goes through this region. So all of these matters need to be discussed, and that the fact that they have agreed upon actually going forward with negotiations on that is quite significant, and it brings us quite closer to maybe a hopeful resolution in the near future for this entire dispute.
Of course, it's been long running. The negotiations on even agreeing to negotiate have probably gone on for a decade or so. So any step forward at this point, a positive one. And particularly if the countries that are directly involved and that have claims come up with the mechanism on their own and then are able to follow through with it. Which brings us to, of course, the main protagonist in any story these days, it seems, irrespective of what part of the world you're talking about. Because the tussle between the US and China is, of course, of key importance for ASEAN, for the Indo-Pacific, and even for the wider region around it. So, where did that figure in conversations? We also have the ASEAN Forum, where some of these other countries are invited, including Russia, India, and others. So what else have you sort of gleaned from reports on these meetings around the main summit?
Well, obviously, the ASEAN summit pretty much it itself actually had the US-China conflict, not necessarily a conflict at this point right now, hopefully, but the kind of disputes of over trade and other sorts of military geostrategic disputes are pretty much looming over much of the issues that they actually discussed. And this includes very particularly to the South China Sea, dispute, which ASEAN does take seriously as a forum, despite the fact that not like most of the countries do not have any claim on the islands or have nothing like no stakes in the
No
islands
stake.
itself. But the fact that like countries that do have stakes in it, that do have claims there, feel that this is a better forum for them to discuss and sort out the matter, and obviously involve China in this matter, shows that they are more, they see more hope in such forums of multilateralism that do not have necessarily a foreign influence, not a foreign influence, obviously,
But a Western dominance.
but yeah, a vested influence, obviously, of somebody who does not have any claims to these islands, who has no like even the face value does not have real stakes on the matter, but obviously is only pretty much involved here by reason of being by the fact that they have a dispute with China overall, and they have a plan to obviously encircle China. The significant fact is that Philippines, which recently have taken a very strongly pro-US stand, is also part of this agreement. Like it's not a like agreement. We are using the term loosely here, but the fact that they have also agreed to become part of these multilateral negotiations is significant, because they themselves have invited the United States very recently to their military ships into the region. They have expanded U.S. military bases in their country, on their land, in places obviously close to the dispute itself, the disputed islands itself. And the fact that they are also opting for this shows that on an overall scale, most of these countries are very well aware of the fact that they can't have a conflict spillover, even if the US or China goes into a conflict, a physical confrontation, they can't be dragged into it. And that is something that many of them do understand at a very fundamental level, and obviously their populations too. And this is something I need to add, like there's a small tidbit of how things were covered. You see the Western media talking about this pact, this agreement to talk and to have negotiations as an agreement towards a non-aggression pact of sorts, which is a very, like the language used is very significant here, because non-aggression pact brings us back to the whole Second World War, Soviet Union, Nazi Germany kind of agreement. But that is not what they're really looking for. They're looking for a framework for resolving the dispute, and not just to not have a physical conflict. In that sense, if you look at the regional coverage of the matter, you look at Singaporean media houses, you look at Hong Kong media houses, including the South China Sea, the South China Morning Post, which is by no means a pro-communist or a rag that we can look at. It is quite a capitalist one and has always been critical of Beijing. But even they have talked about it as a dispute resolution framework that needs to be agreed upon. So this is a small set of, like, this shows what the West really looks at when they talk about the South China Sea, what they really want in that region, and what obviously the countries there who do have stakes in the matter really want in the matter.
All right, thanks. Thanks very much, Anish. We'll leave it there for as far as the ASEAN bit is concerned. But we're talking next about, of course, the Hollywood strike that has expanded to include the SAG-AFTRA union, the Screen Actors Guild, which of course represents actors and performers in Hollywood, who have joined the Writers Guild of America, who have already been on strike, bringing pretty much Hollywood to a complete halt. They are protesting against big studios, major studios in Hollywood for a variety of things. Actually, and Anish is not directly covering this story, but he has clued himself up about what's going on, at least in terms of the news, and will give us a bit of a brief. Anish, images of like glamorous actors in tuxedos and gowns walking out of film premieres to join the picket lines kind of are come up when we heard of the actors joining the strike. How significant is it that the most sort of public facing personalities with millions in terms of social media reach and influence are also now participating in this action that actually in many ways determines the future of this industry?
I mean, let's begin with the fact that this is the first strike since 1960. Now, the first industry-wide strike, which included both actors and writers coming together on common issues. Now, in 1960, and it is also significant why it happened in 1960 as well, where with the advent of television, and television's a very new medium of entertainment, and with that came the need for a new set of contracts that would not put writers and also performers at a loss, because obviously screening of television serials or series and sitcoms do not function the same way as say movies did.
Film does,
and so
yeah.
obviously the kind of what we call residual payments, which is a sort of royalty that you get out of your work, which might be airing or screening for a longer period, it might also give you extra cash and extra income for that. And the fact that that was not that was not covered within when television became a common thing in Hollywood in the United States, the fact that there was a strike then, and they came up with, and obviously the strike went on for 143 days, and they came up with a lasting solution to the matter in a way that actually revolutionized television in the United States as well, and obviously the rest of the world. So this is pretty much the same kind of significance we're looking at. It's a dual strike again. And again, a very new medium we are looking at, streaming television, which is which has a very significantly different way of streaming and airing entertainment works. And that really has a very significant way of affecting writers and performers as well. The fact that unlike television even, streaming channels, streaming platforms will actually have these shows for pretty much eternity, or as long as these platforms function. So they are getting revenues and excess revenues from that, which will not be going into the pockets of performers and writers as well. And so these matters were at the heart of the issue, even in the previous contract negotiations. But obviously, right now with the advent of COVID and because of which you had streaming platforms ballooning to a much, ballooning at the cost of obviously theater and even cable television, pretty much affected the manner in which writers and actors will be like, because even the fact that their unions will not be recognized in negotiations in these shows that will be primarily for streaming platforms, which is at this point most of television, it would actually impact their income as well. So even with the kind of offers that you see, like the differences are quite significant. The current offer that the AMPTP is giving is pretty much gives about $82 million for writers, while the writers are negotiating for an increase that would actually give writers as a whole, we're talking about 11,000 writers. We have to remember that, something about close to 500 million. So this is the big difference of revenue that they look at. And this is significant in the way media is, like with new media, obviously, functioning. Now, the other one, obviously, we need to talk about is AI, which is at the heart of the other fact of it. Producers talking about replacing writers with AI to write scripts for maybe like sitcoms and stuff. And which is something that writers are obviously standing against, because whether or not it's workable is a different thing. But the fact that this is something that is very seriously considered to replace human labor and put them at loss is something that is quite significant. And to look for guardrails against such practices would be a very revolutionary thing in coming days, because obviously AI will be part of entertainment. It will be part of...
It is already,
It is already, exactly. For research and all sorts of matters that actually come in the artistic process. But if it is going to replace willy-nilly human labor, actual people's labor and their employment and livelihoods, that is going to be a problem. And so demanding guardrails for that can actually have an impact for everybody, even outside of the United States at this point.
Fair enough, Anish. Thanks for that quick update. We'll, of course, be following this story and discuss it in much greater detail, perhaps later on next week, when things also become a little more clear in terms of how things might proceed with negotiations, as well as how actors will actually participate in the strike process and who all will be on strike and all of that. But anyway, thanks for that today, and we'll also bring to close this episode of Daily Debrief with that last bit from Manish. As always, we invite you to head to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, for details on these stories and everything else we do. Don't also forget to follow us on the social media platform of your choice. We'll be ending the week tomorrow with a final episode of the Daily Debrief. Until then, stay safe. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.